Hey guys, it's Mrs. Olenichek, and today we're going to talk about species, in particular how new species can arise. So before we do anything, we should probably define species. There's actually a lot of different definitions for species, and there's exceptions to all of them. The most basic definition, the one that we generally use, is this idea of a biological species. A population whose members can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. So essentially, organisms that can make babies that can make babies. They have to be reproductively compatible. So here, you see a whole bunch of humans, and there's lots of variation, but we can all interbreed and produce fertile, viable offspring. Whereas if you look at these two birds, you have the eastern meadowlark and the western meadowlark. They are two distinct species, and that's because they have mating rituals, their songs, and their behaviors. And they're so different that the two species will not interbreed. And so we consider them separate species, even though they look very similar. Essentially, we're looking at macroevolution, so evolution at the species level. And in order for new species to arise, you have to have some sort of isolation. Now, they can be geographically isolated, so they're separated by geographic isolation, yeah. Or reproductively isolated, so they can't reproduce with each other. So they're in different places, or they just can't reproduce with each other. These isolated populations are going to evolve independently from each other, and so over time they're going to accumulate enough differences in their alleles or their allele frequencies, and so they'll no longer be able to interbreed. So this isolation means different environments. Those different environments will select for different characteristics, and over time you can end up with two different species. There's two main types we talk about. Allopatric, that's a geographic separation, so this is other country. Or sympatric, those are populations that still live in the same area or same country. So this isolation can occur when populations get separated and live in different countries or different areas, or populations that live in the same area but for whatever reason no longer interbreed. We also look at barriers that are pre-reproductive or post-reproductive. So a pre-reproductive barrier is something that's an obstacle to mating or to fertilization if mating occurs. So this could be geographic isolation, ecological isolation, temporal, so timing, behavioral, mechanical, and gametic, and we're going to discuss all of these different ones. So geographic isolation is really the kind of the easiest to understand, I think. You have species that live in different areas, and so there's different selective factors because there's different environments. And so over time, those species are isolated, say by the Grand Canyon, and no longer interbreed. There's some sort of physical barrier to that breeding, and over many, many generations, they become different species. So here's an example. You have the antelope squirrel found by the Grand Canyon, and they, over time, we assume that they share a common ancestor, but over time they've evolved into two separate species. Ecological isolation, so these are species that occur in the same region but occupy different habitats, so they rarely encounter one another. So our lion and our tiger are a good example. We say that these organisms are reproductively isolated. So you have these two species here of garter snake. They occur in the same area, but one lives in water and the other is terrestrial. And so those two populations very rarely come in contact with each other and therefore will very rarely mate. And so over time have become reproductively isolated. Same with your lions and tigers. They could hybridize, but they live in different habitats. Lions tend towards grasslands, tigers in the rainforest. And so over time, these populations really don't interact with each other and they become reproductively isolated. Temporal, these are species that breed during different times of the day or different seasons or different years and therefore don't mate with each other. This is another example of a reproductive isolation. And this can be sympatric speciation as well, because these organisms may live in the same area, but because they don't go into heat or estrus at the same time, they're not necessarily going to reproduce with each other. The spotted skunk is a good example. They overlap in range, but they have different mating times. So the eastern spotted skunk mates in late winter and the western mates in late summer. So even if they're living in the same area, they're not out looking for mates at the same time. Here you see a bunch of different frogs that live in the same area, but because they have different times of mating activity, they're less likely to interbreed. And this may be important for reducing competition, particularly when you're young or coming to maturity. So it's beneficial to not be trying to feed your offspring or provide a beneficial environment for your offspring. If you're not all mating at the same time, you have a greater chance of reproductive success. Behavioral isolation. So these are unique behavior patterns or rituals that tend to isolate species. This also allows organisms to identify members of their own species, so they don't waste time showing off for an organism that they can't mate with. You can attract mates of the same species, so it allows you to tell self from non-self, kind of at the species level. And you see a lot of this in birds. And again, it's an example of reproductive isolation. So here we have one of my favorite examples, the blue-footed booby. They have really unique courtship displays. There's a link here where you can just Google it or go to YouTube and try to find a video of the very funny mating dance of the blue-footed booby. We may think it's funny, but the girls love it, and so that allows a female blue-footed booby to find a male of the same species. And we see this in lots of different organisms. So birds have lots of really elaborate mating rituals that allow them to tell self from non-self, also to choose mates that are well suited. You have it in fireflies, so when you see fireflies lighting up, that's them showing off for the ladies. And you have it in other insects that have different calls, same in frogs. All right, another type of isolation is this idea of mechanical isolation. So these are differences that prevent successful mating. Another form of reproductive isolation. So you see a lot of this in plants. So plants depend on their pollinators, so whether those are birds or bees, to pollinate them. So they provide the nectar, the pollinator comes over, gets the pollen on them, and then goes over to another plant, hopefully of the same species, and delivers the pollen, which is essentially plant sperm. It's in the plant's best interest to have pollinators that are very specialized, because that reduces the likelihood that the pollinator is going to come get the pollen and then go over to a plant of a different species, so it kind of wastes the gametes. So here you have these very different shapes and colors, which allows for specialization in pollinators, which reduces the likelihood that they're going to go pollinate a flower of a different species after they leave you. In animals, you find this mechanical isolation in sex organs. So really there's just no way for species for separate species to interact with each other or mate, because their genitals are different shapes. Gametic isolation, here another example of a strategy that works if you're sympatric. So the sperm of one species may not be able to fertilize the eggs of another. There can be biochemical barriers or chemical incompatibilities. An example is your sea urchins. So you have two populations of sea urchins that live in the same area, but their gametes are unable to fuse with gametes of a different species. Now we come to our post-reproductive barriers, and these prevent hybrid offspring from developing into a viable fertile adult. So here we have a zebroid. This is reduced hybrid viability. You can have reduced hybrid fertility or hybrid breakdown, and I'm going to explain what these different things are. So reduced hybrid viability means that you can have genes from different parent species interacting and inhibiting or impairing the hybrid's development. So again, here's another example. You have species of the genus Istatina. They can interbreed, but the hybrids don't complete development, or if they do, they're pretty frail, and so this reduces the likelihood that those two species are going to interbreed. Reduced hybrid fertility. This is where you have sterile offspring. So the famous example is horses and donkeys mate and produce mules, which are vigorous, but they are sterile. And it has to do with the number of chromosomes, right? So they have an odd number of chromosomes, and so they can't separate properly during meiosis or gamete formation. And generally you find that with parents that have different numbers of chromosomes, so even if they can form a hybrid, that hybrid would be sterile. So here you can see. Hybrid breakdown. This is hybrids that can be fertile and viable in the first generation, but then that generation, when it mates, the offspring are either feeble or sterile. And rice hybrids are a good example of that. Polyploidy. This is an organism that has more than 2 complete sets of chromosomes in all of their somatic cells. So instead of being, 1N plus 1N gives you a diploid, so haploid plus haploid gives you diploid, you'd have 2 diploid cells combining, giving you a tetroid, or 4N. This is way more common in plant species, as they lack separate sexes and are capable of asexual reproduction. It could have something to do with the failure in meiotic cells dividing. And like I said, you see a lot of those examples in the plant kingdom, and some of those we encourage. So normal strawberries are teeny tiny. The ones that you buy at the store tend to be polyploid, so these are octoploid. Same with flowers. So rates of speciation. So there's 2 theories about the rate, or how quickly speciation occurs. There's gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. So gradualism is kind of the older idea. Punctuated equilibrium is a little bit newer. Gradualism is just that gradual accumulation of small changes over a long period of time. Whereas punctuated equilibrium states that you have rapid bursts of change mixed with long periods of little or no change. Honestly, it depends on the environment. So both are feasible. If you have an environment that changes slowly, you would have gradualism. If you have large changes in the environment, then you would expect more punctuated equilibrium. So there you go. And Niles Eldridge and Stephen Jay Gould came up with the idea of punctuated equilibrium. So if you have any questions, make sure you write them down and ask when you get to class. Thanks, bye.